Did you know that the roots of American democracy were not laid in a parliament, a fort, or a city, but on a rickety ship in the middle of the ocean? Yes, a ship carrying a few dozen passengers whom the world would later call Pilgrims. They were not just looking for a new land, but were going to lay the foundation for a principle that would change the history of humanity. This is the story of the Mayflower Compact, a short but mighty document that sowed the first seeds of American self-government. Imagine a stormy night, a cold October wind, and a small ship tossing and turning on the merciless waves of the Atlantic. On board were 102 passengers with dreams, fears, and faiths that were as diverse as each other. Some were merchants, some were laborers, and some were religious reformers. But they all had one thing in common. They wanted freedom. Not just religious freedom, but the freedom to make their own decisions. And that desire led them to an era that would forever mark their name in history. Religious persecution was at its peak in England in the 1600s. The Pewter sect was fed up with the religious oppression of King James. They wanted to have the right to worship as they pleased. When that was not possible, they turned to Holland, but the culture and economy of Holland limited their dreams. Then they decided to go to a new world, a place where they could live according to their faith. This decision was not an easy one. They knew that across the sea lay an unknown land where there was no home and no law, but there was a light of hope in their hearts. They chartered a ship called the Mayflower. On board it, they set out to build the settlement of their dreams. They were joined by some merchants who went with the intention of profit. Thus, this unique caravan of religion and trade set off together, but they had no idea that this journey would not only be a search for land, but also the creation of an ideology. When the journey began, the weather was unpredictable. Strong winds, thunderclouds, and roaring waves. Many passengers fell ill, some even died. But the people on that ship were not among those who gave up. They knew that their destination was not just a port, but a world where man could make his own laws. For them, the voyage was a test of faith, and faith became their greatest weapon. When the ship's voyage ended in November 1620, the place they arrived at was very different from their original goal. They wanted to reach the Virginia colony, but fate brought them to the shores of Cape Cod. This region was not under the jurisdiction of any government. That is, there was no king's rule here, nor was there a governor. This feeling soon turned to fear. If there is no law, how will order be maintained? This is where the question arose that gave rise to the Mayflower Compact. Dissensions began to grow on the ship. Some passengers said, "This place is outside the king's law. We are no longer bound by anyone's orders." On the other hand, the religious group wanted some regulation. Otherwise, anarchy would spread. The conflict intensified. Then their leaders said, "If we are to survive, we must make our own laws." And so began a crucial moment in history. In the lower deck of the ship, in the cold night, in the dim light of an oil lamp, they all gathered. They decided to make a written agreement that everyone would agree to. There would be no king, no army, no coercion, but consent, justice, and equality. And this document was called the Mayflower Compact. This short document was the first formal declaration of man's right to govern himself. On the morning of November 11th, 1620, when the sea was calm, 41 men signed the compact. Among them were William Bradford, John Carver, Miles Standish, and other leaders. Each signature was not just a name, but a pledge that they would obey the law, respect each other's rights, and make decisions in the best interest of the community. This was the moment when America's first self-governed community came into being. The document consisted of only a few lines, but it reflected an entire political philosophy. It stated that all people would make laws for the common good. Every decision would be made by collective consent. This concept, that government, comes from the will of the people, later became the basis for the U.S. Constitution. It was the first time that European colonists had established their own government outside of a monarchy. The Mayflower Compact's most fundamental principle was self-governance through consent of the governed. This idea was later reflected in the philosophies of Thomas Jefferson and John Locke. It was not just a temporary agreement, but a declaration of the collective responsibility of man. We will make laws together, enforce them, and establish a just society, they said. After this agreement, they set foot on the shores and founded Plymouth Colony. It was the first self-governing colony in North America. Here, everything was decided by consultation. Laws were made locally, and everyone had equal rights, a revolutionary concept for the time. But with freedom came hardships. Cold, hunger, disease, and relations with native tribes all were challenges. More than half the people died in the first winter. But the children, their determination did not break them. For them, there was no way back, because they knew if they went back, their dream would die. William Bradford was the figure who played a key role in making that dream a reality. He not only led, but also preserved the entire experience in his writings. His book, Of Plymouth Plantation, is still the primary testimony of the Mayflower voyage. He wrote that we built a community where the law was equal for all, and government was by the consent of all. John Carver was elected the first governor. This election was not by the decree of a king, but by the decision of the people. This was the first manifestation of electoral leadership in American politics. Carver established order, established laws and created an atmosphere of mutual respect. He did not live long, but his leadership strengthened the foundation of democracy. For the Pilgrims, religion and politics were inseparable. Their faith was the foundation of their government. They believed that justice, honesty, and community should all be in accordance with the will of God. But they also held to the principle that everyone's voice should be heard, regardless of their beliefs. This balance later became the hallmark of American democracy. Initially, their relations with the Native American tribes were tense, but they soon realized that cooperation was necessary for survival. They made a treaty with the Wampanoag tribe, which brought peace to both. As a result of this friendship, the tradition of Thanksgiving was born. It was a story based on the principles of humanity, unity, and survival. Plymouth society had few hierarchies. Each person earned his place through hard work. There was no discrimination based on position, wealth, or race. This was in stark contrast to European society at the time. This experience later became the basis for the American idea of equal opportunity. An important principle of the Mayflower Compact was the rule of law. That is, no one is above the law. This principle was considered revolutionary at the time because in Europe, the king was the law. Here, on a small ship, the law was given to the people for the first time. And this later became the spirit of the American Constitution. The idea that government comes into being by the consent of the people was not new in human history, but the Mayflower Compact gave it practical form. It was the first practical example of a social contract. Later, philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau expanded on this concept, but its seeds were sown in 1620. For the first time, leadership was not inherited but by trust. Every decision was made by consultation. This was the moment when the concept of leadership by consent was born. That is, there is no authority without the people. This was the principle that set the direction of America's democratic journey. For the Pilgrims, freedom was not just about separating from the church. It was the freedom to make your own decisions, learn from your own mistakes, and write your own destiny. They showed that democracy was not just a system, but a way of thinking. This idea later spread across the continent. Modern historians say that the Mayflower Compact was the early draft of the American Constitution. It was the first experiment in constitutional thought. Some historians also call it America's first constitution. Although it was short, its meaning was profound. It became a symbol of the collective consciousness of man. The colonies that followed the Mayflower Compact began to adopt the same model. Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island drew up their treaties in the same way. It became a chain of self-government, which later led to the American Revolution of 1776 when the Pilgrims signed the Mayflower Compact. They probably had no idea that they were changing world politics, but their small act proved that man could govern justly without kings. It was the moment when the dream of government by the people became a reality. The Mayflower Compact was not just a document, it was also a practical experiment. Now the question was, would these principles prove as strong on the ground as they were on paper? There were conflicts among the people in the beginning. Some people would disagree over leadership, others would prioritize their own interests, but each time they would return to the same principle. We have made a collective agreement, and the law is equal for all of us. This principle became the pillar of their survival. This treaty was a lesson not just for one nation, but for all of humanity. It showed that if people trusted each other and believed in justice, they could establish order without kings or armies. It was a testament to man's natural ability to make their own decisions. This was the thinking that later inspired freedom movements around the world. Although the Pilgrims were deeply committed to religion, as they formed their new community, they realized that survival was possible not only through faith, but also through tolerance. They included people of different faiths and emphasized that faith was a personal matter, but law was collective. This thinking later became the cornerstone of American religious freedom. Education was given special importance in Plymouth Colony. They knew that if people did not read, they would not be able to understand their government. That is why schools were established, so that everyone could understand the law and faith. This was the foundation on which the public education system was later built. Knowledge was made the companion of freedom. The standard of leadership changed after the Mayflower Compact. Now the leader is not the one who is powerful, but the one who is honest and consultative. This principle was later adapted into the concept of public servant in American democracy, where the leader is not the ruler of the people, but the servant. This thought was no less than a revolution in the journey of history. The government of Plymouth was based on moral principles. Here, truth and honesty were not just religious words, but practical values. The law was followed not only by fear, but also by conscience. This was the balance that was later reflected in the moral foundation of the American Constitution. This was the first time when ordinary people began to consider themselves equal to the law. No rich or poor, no king or queen, all were equal citizens. This thought was revolutionary. At a time when the gap between the king and the subjects existed in Europe, the Mayflower Compact said, "We are all members of one community, and the law shall apply equally to all." When the community started making decisions collectively, they realized how much power there was in unity. Every decision was made through consultation, every opinion was heard. This was the first practical manifestation of participatory governance. This concept later took root in the U.S. Senate, Congress, and local government systems. leaders. Although women did not have the right to vote or lead, their sacrifices and contributions were undeniable. They were the ones who took care of the home, educated the children, and strengthened the foundations of society. It was a quiet revolution, one that later became the basis for the women's rights movement. The Pilgrims lived in harmony with nature in their new world. They treated the land, trees, and rivers with respect. This love of nature was later reflected in American environmentalist ideas. They understood that self-government was a responsibility not only to humans but also to the earth. Over time, the principles of the Mayflower Compact began to spread to other colonies. These principles were not limited to the religious community. Inspired by them, the Massachusetts Bay Colony also created its own charters. In other words, a treaty written on a ship began to change the direction of the entire continent. When the Declaration of Independence was declared in 1776, Thomas Jefferson and other leaders rewrote these same principles. Government is by the will of the people. This phrase was actually an echo of the Mayflower Compact. Thus, this document emerged as the intellectual seed of the American Revolution. The Mayflower Compact was actually a practical example of a social contract. It was an agreement in which the people themselves molded their collective power into a system. This is the same concept that was later presented on philosophical grounds by Rousseau, Locke, and Hobbes. That is, the government is the creation of the people, and the people are the source of its survival. Historians still call the Mayflower Compact a unique experiment. According to them, it was the first written document that recognized people's authority. Some historians say that if this agreement had not been there, the course of American history would have been different. This small piece of paper was actually a great victory for human consciousness. The Mayflower Compact was not only political but also spiritual. It was an expression of the belief that justice and faith are not opposites to each other but companions. This same balance is important in today's world, where there is law but nothing without humanity. If we look at today's democratic systems, they are rooted in the same principles that were expressed in the Mayflower Compact. Whether it's public participation, equality, or the rule of law, all of these are gifts from that historic moment when a few people stood in the middle of the ocean and said, "We will make our own government." Today, the world is once again embroiled in division, power, and wars of interest. In such a situation, the message of the Mayflower Compact reminds us that democracy is not just a vote but a commitment, a promise that we will live for justice, respect, and the common good. This compact teaches us that a great revolution does not always require a large army or a large building. Sometimes a few determined people sitting in a small ship can change the course of history. All it takes is intention and agreement. The Mayflower Compact was actually the first declaration of the awakening of the collective conscience of humanity. It was proof that man can write his own destiny. It was a milestone not only in American history but in human history, where for the first time power was given to the people. So now the question is, if you were among those 41 people, would you have signed this compact? Would you risk ruling yourself without a king? Tell us in the comments, because perhaps your answer will tell us whether the spirit of the Mayflower Compact is still alive in us today. This was the story of the Mayflower Compact, a ship, a few dreams, and a pact that changed the world. This is not just history but a cry for human freedom.